is like sunshine for the belly.
My guest today is Erik Fowler, the Education and Engagement Manager for White Labs Yeast. White Labs Yeast was inspired by a group of homebrewers looking for high-quality yeast. From there, it grew into a team of biochemists finding ways to advance the brewing process. Last year, I was able to get a tour of the facility, and let's just say fermentation is magic. I completely nerded out. Thanks so much for joining me, Erik.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm stoked we get to do this. Anytime we can kind of spread the gospel of one of the least sexy ingredients, we're always happy to, because there's some awesome stories, which, hopefully we'll get to.
Yeah, I mean, yeast, I feel like, is the underappreciated workhorse of the brewery. It's like, 70% of flavor comes from yeast? So
yeah, over 500 flavor and aroma compounds come from yeast or some derivative and effect on that. So it's crazy how often it's underlooked. And I think it tends to be underlooked, to be honest, because it seems complicated. It seems daunting, right? Hops and malt, we can grasp on to the concepts of how they're adding flavor, how they're grown, how they're produced, because they're similar to other agriculture ingredients we work with in our kitchen every day. Whereas we work with yeast in our kitchen, but it just seems, it reminds a lot of people of their middle school, biology class.
Yeah, it's definitely different holding hops or grain in your hand versus having this slurry that to really see what's going on, you have to have a microscope to look at.
Yeah, totally. But, a lot of times, people are quick to point the finger at something going wrong because of the yeast. But, when it comes to fermentation, the activity of that yeast is something that's pretty tangible, right? And airlock bubbling or krausen is one of our favorite things, because you spend 6 hours, 8 hours that day brewing to waking up the next morning and smelling that and, seeing that activity is pretty exciting and tangible.
Yeah, I love it. I had a Play-Doh airlock for a while, and seeing the bubbles per minute when I was at work on my phone, I was just like, oh, it's happening. I love it.
Yeah, that's next level nerdum right there. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really what makes the magic happen. I always say fermentation is like magic, and one thing to do with that is that you can't really see the yeasts that are actually doing all the work. So what is the process of developing a yeast strain? I know White Labs has many at this point, and wondering how you get all of these different yeast strains.
Yeah, we have hundreds and hundreds of strains banked, sourced from different periods, different, breweries, different places on earth, different major brewing regions. And it can be daunting when you have accumulated so many strains over the 25 years that we've been around, and over the 9,000 years people have been brewing. But being able to determine what strains we're most excited about and what's most relevant to people, and communicating that, we could be really excited about a strain, but if we don't tell that story the right way or relate it to something that's current, it can kind of go unnoticed, even though it's a really cool strain, because there's so many available and there's been so many that have been domesticated. When it comes to actually like developing a yeast, so 99.9% of brewers' yeast strains on the market are non-GMO, so they're not genetically modified, and every strain in our bank is non-GMO. So it's taken about 500 years for brewers to actually domesticate these strains and develop them. And they've developed them by passing it from brewer to brewer to brewer, or, we're talking about food, brewer to baker, and vice versa. And that's kind of a cool relationship, because they're both using the same species of yeast, or Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is ale yeast, right? And over that time, that yeast has kind of been selected and grown accustomed to the environment in which we use it in, which yeast don't really want to ferment and create ethanol, right? That's that toxifies the environment that they're in. But what that does is allows them to a little bit more longevity and help kill any competition, anything else that might be in that environment too. So what we've done is we've banked these strains that have been naturally domesticated, or some fun strains that might be found wild on fruit, just naturally occurring in the environment too. And we've banked those. So then our process is determining what's relevant, what people actually want. Does it work for a business? Does it actually grow? Because there's some really cool strains that might not really grow that well or consistently, and it might produce an awesome beer, but a lot of what people are looking for when they come to a lab to buy yeast is consistency. It doesn't mean that some of that natural microflora that's found in spontaneous sour beers are any less important, but those are can be a little bit more difficult to control. So finding something that's consistent that we can propagate, grow, and continue to put out there and has some longevity to it and then most importantly, create something that tastes good.
Yeah, it's funny to me that yeast was technically like the most recently discovered ingredient in beer. And before, they were just using the same stick to stir the wort, and it just happened. And it's great that we now have more control over it. But it's also it's just kind of interesting to think before we discovered it, what those beers kind of tasted like, because it presumably everyone's beer tasted slightly different because the yeast was all slightly different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and looking back on beer style history and brewing history, I think it's easy to start looking at it through a romantic lens and getting really excited about it. Man, that beer back, in the 1700s when IPAs were first becoming popular must have tasted awesome. There's a good chance that it didn't taste very good.
Yeah.
And a big reason, there's probably multiple reasons that have to do with processing and ingredients and brewing techniques, but a big reason is they didn't understand microbiology. They probably weren't very clean, and there were probably a lot of organisms living in those beers, which we've kind of come to find out to be true now. So again, it's not that one's worse than the other, but as consumers, as brewers, we look for consistency a lot of the time, and controlling yeast is just one of those elements of controlling that consistency.
Speaking of consistency, I know that White Labs has a very intuitive packaging system that helps out with your consistency and sterility. Will you tell us about what it is and how it works?
Yeah, definitely. So, I believe it was within the last, a little over 5 years ago, we've got an internal conference that was called the World Domination Conference. Is kind of tongue in cheek. And every year, different employees from different parts of the company would pitch ideas, and it could be on sustainability, it could be on new products, it could just be on internal culture building. Well, years beyond this product and this process even being developed, Troels Prahl, who leads our Copenhagen facility and is head of our innovation, came up with the idea on how can we cut down on transfers. And the result was what we now call our flex cell process. So a lot of times when you propagate yeast, there's a lot of transfers involved, meaning you have to take that yeast from one vessel that you're growing it in, put it somewhere else to package it. But what the flex cell process does is actually takes the large film that it's in, it propagates in there. So you're growing yeast in this film, and then subdivide it and package in a subsection of that film. So what you see today with Pure Pitch, which is the finished product, is actually one small subset of that larger film. So that mitigated a lot of transfers, which is possible exposure, which could, if you introduce any oxygen, can actually stress the yeast and deplete some of the glycogen reserves within the cell. Added risk of contamination. And then more importantly, those, maybe not more importantly, but consequently, those transfers require more cleaning. So you're using more chemicals in that process too. So it really made a lot of sense from pushing the product to a higher quality. But it is, a unique process to us. We do have a patent on this process. So it took a long time to really develop and implement it. And we've got a lot of awesome things coming down the pipeline too. So be on the lookout in the next year or two for some additional cool additions.
Love it. So White Labs has done collaborations in the past. One that I'm extremely interested is the collaboration they did with McKellar on the Wreck Ale. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that one.
The Wreck Ale is, one of a number of interesting projects that we've worked on. When we started opening we've got a production facility in Brew Pub in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm based here in San Diego. And, as we were building that facility and it was just a shell, we sent a group out there and we were looking at the floor plan. We went out to dinner and went to a local bar, and totally unrelated. I don't know how the topic started, but somebody started talking about this really cool beer that they heard of, that was, the yeast was actually sourced from the brewer's beard. And it was really funny to see the door person at this bar tell us all about this, not knowing the group that he was telling it to. And what it was, that beer was actually called Beard Beer from Rogue Brewing up in the Pacific Northwest. And for that project, we sent a team up there and they tried to find yeast all over the brew house. And it's likely that the yeast that they're going to find is the yeast used in that brewery, because, they're dealing with large quantities of it. But as a joke, they swabbed the brewer's beard and inflated it, ended up finding some yeast on it that was alcohol tolerant, so they could brew a beer with it. And they ended up brewing a beer with the Neva. So that was a ship that in the mid to late 1800s actually crashed into another ship and sunk. It was carrying a lot of beer though. And when that sunk, a lot of the beer was preserved. So what we saw is, very cold temperatures at the bottom of the ocean. It's not really being disturbed because there's not a whole lot of movement down there, and there's zero light. So it was a pretty ideal location to store beer, which is not really what most people would think of when they think of a ship crashing. But there was a team of divers and teaming up with McKellar, who's got a facility near us in Europe, in Copenhagen. And we were able to get involved and actually take some of those bottles and find living yeast that we could then propagate. And they brewed a beer with it, which is pretty cool. So there's a long string of stories like that. I mean, finding yeast at the bottom of the ocean is probably one of the coolest, but yeast is a pretty hardy organism. So it's not surprising or not unheard of that it's survived in those conditions for over 100 years.
Yeah, when I was doing my research for this episode, one of the people I attributed a quote to, that I'm not going to remember their name right now, but he said that yeast is the most resilient organism on Earth. It's just it's impossible to get rid of somehow. It's just taken over everything, which I mean, it helps us out for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it helps preserve things and consumables that we weren't able to preserve for a long time. So, not just brewing beer, but, a lot of other fermented products. And you look at most cultures have some aspect of fermentation, in their culinary culture. And that's because, resources are finite, and if you can make something last a little bit longer, and more importantly, help pre-digest it and make it healthier for you. I'm not advocating beer is healthy, but
I mean, at one point when the water wasn't good, it was.
yeah, very true.
So does White Labs have any new strains of yeast they're coming out with, or anything that we should be getting excited about that you can tell us?
Yeah, as I said, that the R&D process of developing a new strain is pretty intensive. Sometimes it can be quick if we're familiar with that strain, or maybe there's a brewer or two that have used it quite a bit that, now let us release it into a wider audience. But sometimes it's, a lot of R&D trials that take months and sometimes years. The most recent strain that we've released to our vault, which is kind of a pre-order program, which allows a lot of these cool strains that might be a little bit more unique, and allows brewers to go in there and show interest in them, was our WLP 631 Appalachian Tart. And what this was is, one of our sales managers, we all still homebrew a lot. I tend to brew more tried and true recipes and, really stick to what I know, because the days of spending a lot of time on something that doesn't turn out, I've got a family and, work's busy and all that. So I try to be a little bit more consistent in my brewing. He likes going outside the box. He's got a grandfather, which helps. So it's a little bit easier, whereas I have to lug my cooler out and all that. And he has been one of the staples of pushing Kvike strains and working with them and trying to get more in-house and experiment with them. And his excitement bled to this Appalachian Tart blend, and it's a blend of a Kvike and a lactic acid producing bacteria. They both thrive in those warmer temperatures, so 90 to 100, 105 Fahrenheit, and was able to mix those and then produce a sour beer that fermented out in 2-3 days, which is pretty awesome. Yeah, so
that's insane.
Yeah, it's great. And we did a lot of trials to make sure that it was consistent and it produced a good tasting beer. And it did, and all of our trials showed a lot of promise. So we released that into the vault pretty recently, and I hope come summer, when people can't really get their knockout temps as low as they want, you can knock out pretty high instead of spending 45 minutes waiting for your work to chill, chill it down to 90, 95, pitch this blend, let it ferment, and within a week you could have an awesome tart, kettle sour Berliner Weiss type beer.
That's awesome. Yeah, in Southern California, it is always the biggest struggle to keep anything at fermentation temperature. I've got glycol running here, and that is like my saving grace now. Yeah, I've got a little stasis system by Craft a Brew that's running the brewery now. I can't ferment anything without it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, groundwater is, it can be in the 80s midsummer out here. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, same up here, and 120 degrees outside. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Erik. This was really enlightening. I'm super excited to get my hands on that strain. I actually just tapped into a sour beer that is 4 years old now, and it turned out real nice, but it would have been even nicer if I could have brewed it and fermented it real hot. To follow what's happening at White Labs, you can check out them on Instagram at White Labs Yeast, and you can follow Erik directly at Erik Beer and Barbecue, Erik spelled with a K, for some delicious looking rib and beer photos. Your ribs look to die for, and I can't wait to start barbecuing again.
Drinking beer, it makes you happy. It makes me happy too. It's truly manna from the gods of Satan. Let's raise a toast, drink it up, sip it down, gallop it. Toot sweet.